be advised that this recorded webinar has been edited from its original format, which may have included a product demo. To set up a live demo or to request more information, please complete the form to the right. Or if you are currently not on CSE Global, there is a link to the website in the description of this video. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, ICANN 66, Insights from Montreal. My name is Annie Tripoletti, and I will be your moderator. Joining us today is Gretchen Olive. Gretchen is the Director of Policy and Global Domain Name Services for CSE. For nearly 2 decades, Gretchen has helped Global 2000 companies devise global domain names, trademarks, and online brand protection strategies, and is a leading authority on the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers new gTLD program. And with that, let's welcome Gretchen.
Thanks, Annie. And yes, again, we do have a lot of material to cover. It doesn't seem like there's ever a dull moment at an ICANN meeting. So this time we'll, of course, touch upon the key policy updates, including the Expedited Policy Development Process Phases 1 and 2, as well as the rights protection mechanisms and subsequent procedures, PDPs. We'll talk some about domain abuse, DNS abuse, and then some of the takeaways from the GAC communique. So before we dive into the agenda, let's just make sure we get a few of the basics down so we all start on the same kind of base level. I do recognize a few new names in our registration today, so let's make sure everybody's up to speed. So first of all, ICANN is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, and they're the organization that governs the domain name space. And what you see here on this slide is really an org chart of sorts for ICANN. ICANN is a bottom-up consensus policy-making multi-stakeholder model. I know that is a mouthful, but it really is made up of a very diverse population. So in the kind of the top darker blue bar, you'll see the board of directors, kind of ICANN staff, the ombudsman, and then those lighter blue boxes are different supporting organizations representing different areas of the community. And then all the way to the right, you'll see a series of gray and dark gray boxes, and those are different advisory committees, typically made up of either technical or governmental officials. One of the groups that we often talk about is the one in the darkest gray box, the Governmental Advisory Committee. That's a committee that's made up of different representatives, typically coming from like telecom ministries around the world, and they really come and advise the ICANN board on the policies that are kind of bubbling up through that multi-stakeholder consensus policy-making process at ICANN. They're providing inputs in terms of how is that going to kind of relate or kind of sync up with public policy and sort of public need. So it's a very interesting dynamic between the Governmental Advisory Committee and the Board of Directors. Another box I'll just sort of highlight is the GNSO, and that's where a lot of the policies that we talk about in this webinar series kind of bubble up to get to the Board of Directors. Another kind of baseline thing I want to make sure everybody understands is that ICANN has 3 public meetings per year. They do meet kind of intersession, but there's these 3 public meetings, and this 3rd meeting in the October-November timeline is called Meeting C, but it really is sort of their annual general meeting of the ICANN board, and it's really it's the longest of the meetings. It's also the one where ICANN really spends a fair amount of time kind of showcasing its accomplishments over the year. So it's really, it's about the broader community and the broader group's achievements. Okay, so now we're ready to jump into the agenda, and what we're going to do is we're going to first hit the key policy updates. We'll start with the Expedited Policy Development Process, or the EPDP, and talking about sort of where we are in Phase 1 and Phase 2. So the EPDP is the Expedited Policy Development Process, and really this process got initiated because of the GDPR. As many people know, the GDPR is a General Data Protection Regulation, and it became enforceable on May 25th, 2018. Its goal really was to kind of harmonize the different data privacy laws across Europe, kind of put that umbrella over it, so that it'd be a little bit easier for people to navigate the data privacy rules within Europe. But the challenge is that GDPR is in direct conflict with legacy ICANN WHOIS policy. specifically the public disclosure of contact data behind domain registration. So, as you know, in the WHOIS, there's the registrant contact, the admin contact, the billing contact, the technical contact. And while we advise our customers not to put personal information in there, and that's been the case for years, many people do, people who just have individual domain registrations, for a family purpose or a personal purpose. And even some companies, the folks who are, responsible for domain registration, they do put their personal information in there sometimes too. So this is a problem with GDPR, and so ICANN was forced in May of 2018 to issue something called a temporary specification. And really it was kind of a way to kind of bridge the gap between the enforceability of GDPR and hopefully a final policy around WHOIS within the ICANN environment. So we're now kind of in that process of working through this expedited policy development process, which quite honestly is the first time it's ever happened. An expedited policy development process is the first time it's ever happened in the ICANN, the life of ICANN. So this is something that is new to everyone, and we're kind of mulling through right now. So the temporary specification that was issued by ICANN required a significant kind of reduction and redaction of WHOIS contact data, really eliminating access to contact names, email addresses, postal addresses, phone numbers. And this has really hindered brand protection efforts. As the year has gone on, the WHOIS has gotten darker and darker, and the tools that once really provided quite a bit of data that could be correlated have really gone kind of dark. So what's really needed to happen now is, there was this this policy work was divided into two phases, Phase 1 and Phase 2. Phase 1 was about the collection and handling of WHOIS contact data and the request for WHOIS data. And that PDP team completed their work within a year, which was mandated under the expedited policy expedited policy development process. So they did complete their work, issue a final report, and we'll talk about where that work is right now. But then Phase 2 kicked off, and that is really about the access to the WHOIS data by registrars, registries, ICANN, and other third parties. So we're kind of in this time period where things are very uncertain, nothing's really finalized, work is being done, and it's really causing quite a bit of challenge for brand protection efforts. Let's dive into where exactly Phase 1 is. As I mentioned, the EPDP Phase 1 team did finish kind of its work. It issued a final report in February of 2019. That was earlier this year. There was a public comment period, and that ended in mid-April, and the ICANN board did adopt 27 of the 29 recommendations without change in May of 2019. ICANN then assembled kind of what this implementation planning team, which is ICANN staff, and this implementation review team, which is part of the community, kind of put them together to work to really achieve the implementation of the new registration data consensus policy. So that's kind of what they've been up to so far. Now the team is working on kind of drafting that policy language based on those EPDP Phase 1 recommendations. So those recommendations were really kind of concepts. They weren't policy language. So now the team has to go and kind of deconstruct those concepts into actual policy language, and that's what they've kind of been grinding through. Challenge it has been, though, that their efforts have really been delayed by conflicts between the Phase 1 recommendations and ICANN's thick WHOIS policies. And for those who don't know what kind of thick WHOIS is that in the domain world, there's thin WHOIS and thick WHOIS. So thick WHOIS is where you have all the registry holds all the contact information, and they're the kind of the authoritative source for that WHOIS information. A thin registry is where the registry doesn't hold the contact data. The registrar, who is the sponsoring registrar of the registration, holds that contact data, and they are the authoritative source for the WHOIS information. So When ICANN did all the new gTLD work, and as they've been doing new contracts, a lot of the requirements for thick WHOIS have been coming into play, and that's particularly the case. Really, one of the only remaining thin registries is .com and .net. So VeriSign is 2 registries. There's also a couple other smaller registries, but .com is obviously the one that has caused most people kind of the challenge of finding who's behind a registration for many, many years, because you have to actually go to the registrar, and not all registrars have made it easy for people to get that WHOIS information. So they've been slowed by kind of trying to reconcile these ICANN thick WHOIS policies and the Phase 1 recommendations. And so you can see there's a little graph here. This is sort of almost like a whiteboarding by the working group during ICANN 66, where they were kind of looking at, okay, if we kind of, start from here, how does this map out in terms of when we can finally start to look at potentially having implementation? And you can see it goes out into 2021. So I know that's not what a lot of people want to hear. I know that's very disappointing for, CSC and its clients. So, but this is, it's consensus is never easy, and that's one of the biggest challenges and one of the things that makes ICANN policy development so slow. But we're really hoping that these dates can stick. But this team has definitely had some challenges in kind of keeping pace just because of some of these hurdles that they've come across. All right, so now let's drill down into EPDP Phase 2. So that officially began in May 2019. So when ICANN board approved most of the recommendations from Phase 1, at that point that then triggered the initiation of Phase 2. They're really tasked with answering charter questions and drafting policy recommendations based on a system for what's called Standardized Access and Disclosure, SSAD. So this is all about, Phase 1 is all about, okay, what are the data elements that are going to be collected and what's going to be public and what's going to be non-public. And now this Phase 2 is, okay, that non-public data, when and who should have access to that data. When should access be allowed and who should have access to that data. So they are wading through those issues. They're also looking through issues from the annex to the temporary specification and items from Phase 1 that are specifically noted for the final report. So they don't have a small task. They have quite a large basket of issues to get through. But they are, as I mentioned earlier, kind of doing the work, and we're just kind of like in the middle of this work. And so it's one of those things where you're constantly looking for, like, when's the end going to be, but we're really square in the middle. So when we talk about sort of this, SSAD model, this kind of standardized access and disclosure, what is the model that, is being discussed? Well, I know we've shown this diagram before, and unfortunately it doesn't get any less confusing each time we put it up. But it is kind of the best depiction that we have so far of what is being contemplated. And really, the thought is that, ICANN would be the controller of the data. And, kind of requests would come in through them, and then they would kind of go through the ecosystem to get the data, and then it would come back to be disclosed if all the requirements were met. It is still a question whether or not this model is going to be acceptable to the European Commission. And, so there's been some dialogue behind the scenes between ICANN and EU representatives about, and the DPAs, the Data Protection Authority, to kind of try to understand if this is going to be acceptable. There hasn't been a clear answer to that question yet, and so there's a lot of angst about this, and there's a lot of discussion about liability and who's going to have liability for what. So it is a tricky and messy issue, but it's one where I think if we could just get some clarity if this would be acceptable to the EU in terms of being compliant with GDPR, having kind of ICANN sit in the middle there and everything kind of revolve through them, that would, I think, help people move forward. But right now there's a lot of like, well, let's just work on the stuff that we know is going to be okay, why this is being sorted out, and it's kind of, I think, making things happen out of order, and it's hard for people to get their heads around some of the other policy issues without really having a clear path on how this data is going to kind of be stored and how the whole process is going to flow. There's definitely going to be, you know, criteria in terms of like what is a legitimate request. There's going to be who can be accredited, what will those accreditation criteria be, administering that accreditation process. There's just so much that's to do here, but like I said, they are smack in the middle of this work, and so right now it's just to sort of kind of watching and waiting to see where this all falls out. So here's another one of those kind of fabled timeline documents. It's one of the things that ICANN always likes to do. Any working group, any ICANN staff presentation, there's always these timeline documents, and they change over time because, you know, people will put kind of flags in the sand right now. That one thing I've learned over the last 20 years with ICANN is that these timelines will shift. So I think we should expect that with this here too. You can see this goes well into 2020 with some of the work in terms of putting together final documentation, etc. But I largely expect that this will shift, but this is kind of current thinking. All right, so now we're going to put the EPDP in the rearview mirror, and we're going to move on to some of the other ongoing policy development processes going on. The first is the rights protection mechanisms. The rights protection mechanisms, or RPM, PDP status, like what it seems like most policy development processes, this was also broken up into phases. Phase 1 covered kind of all the RPMs applicable to the new gTLDs that launched under the 2012 program. So you had things like the Trademark Post-Delegation Dispute Resolution Procedure. I know that is a mouthful. Trademark Clearinghouse, Sunrise and Trademark Claim Services, Uniform Rapid Suspension Dispute Resolution Procedure. And then Phase 2 is expected to focus on the Uniform Dispute Resolution Policy, or the UDRP, which was really an RPM that existed even before the new gTLD program, but that was also included as part of the new gTLD program. So as many of you will remember, this is a PDP that's been going on since it's around March of 2016. So this has been one that's been going on for a while. So let's kind of pick up the action, if you will, from the last ICANN meeting, which was ICANN 65. Since then, they've completed the review of and approval of the Sunrise and Trademark Claims sub-team recommendations, so that's good. They're nearing completion of the review of the structure and scope of the TMCH, and they're also discussing the use of a survey or other means to further vet individual Uniform Rapid Suspension, or URS, proposals. So that's the work that they've accomplished since the last ICANN meeting. As a result of the discussions at this ICANN meeting, they now have agreed to open questions for inclusion on the initial report, complete a review of the draft initial report, and then hope by January 2020 that the work group will actually publish the initial report for public comment. So that's something we're very much looking forward to seeing and reviewing and sharing insights about. So that's definitely coming up after the top of the year. So here's another one of those ICANN timeline slides. They either love the bar graphs or the little bubbles. So this one, I actually feel relatively confident about this one. And I think that's because this PDP has been going on for so long. We're more than 3 years in. and we really are coming down to the end. So I think this timeline at this point is pretty close to what we're going to see here to the end. So certainly somewhere in 2020, likely around Q2, we'll get to the final report to be sent to the GNSO. So that will be great to finally close this one up. The next PDP we're going to cover is the subsequent procedures PDP. A lot of times you'll hear people refer to this one as subpro. So the subpro PDP is really one that also had quite a number of kind of parts to it. Instead of phases, they call them work tracks, so you can kind of see work tracks 1 through 5. It really is kind of a catch-all, if you will. It's everything that didn't fit into RPMs seems to have fallen into this new gTLD subsequent procedures PDP. It really is kind of looking at the applicant guidebook and all the procedures and processes that were involved in the kind of the whole rollout of the new gTLD program, kind of except the rights protection mechanisms. It's looking at all those anew and kind of trying to understand what worked, what didn't work, and if something didn't work, what do we need to do to correct it? So again, this team's probably been working for close to 3 years, but now they're also starting to wind down their work, but still have a bit to do. So let's talk about some of those kind of outstanding issues that still need some work, and in fact probably some further public comment. So first of all is implementation, predictability. Really need to finalize that framework of what's called the Standing Predictability Implementation Review Team, or SPIRT. ICANN is not for lacking of acronyms, and that one is definitely a new one, and one that I think is one I'll probably remember for a long time. There's also the work still to be done sort of around future TLD rounds, meaning what should be the threshold requirement for commencement of both the next round and future rounds. There's a lot of discussion around, do we need more TLDs? When ICANN was created, that was one of their primary objectives, was to bring more namespace to the internet and to also bring more competition to the namespace. So, registries, registrars, that type of thing. But with the future TLD rounds, I mean, right now we have just about 1,300 TLDs out there, and we are, there's some that are certainly very viable, and viability not meaning they have tons of registrations, but there's some that are really defined communities, are working on very kind of specific issues. They might not have millions of registrations, but they are viable. However, there's more than a few that are really struggling. So what really is the trigger for the next round? Is it the need for more TLDs, or is it the sort of the demand for people to be able to apply for more TLDs? And what are some of those threshold issues? There's also some discussion about the next round might be another application window, but do we need to do application windows for future, or should it be kind of on a rolling basis? So there's still some more work to do to really understand what triggers the commencement of future rounds of new gTLDs. Then there's the what's called the Bureau accreditation. So Bureau is the back-end registry operator. They are the folks who are providing the technology behind these different TLDs. And in the last round, every TLD had to go through kind of pre-delegation testing to make sure that their back-end technology was viable. Well, as you can imagine, while there was over 1,000 TLDs, there aren't 1,000 different registry back-end technical providers. And so in many cases, there was just sort of like a constant reevaluation of the same players. And it really was viewed as very kind of inefficient and likely adding a lot of cost to the process and the program that didn't need to be there. So there's been a fair amount of discussion about, well, maybe there should just be sort of like a pre-qualification or pre-accreditation process for these registry back-end providers. And how would that look? But there's also kind of this question about, you know, where is there ambiguity there between the pre-approval versus the testing requirements? So more clarification needed, some more detailed policy work to be done there, and definitely something I think there needs to be some more public comment on. Then we also have the issue around closed generics. That was a highly controversial issue, as many of the brands that were launching, some of them not only had their kind of company brand, but they also had some generic words that, you know, were associated with the industry that they were in, that they applied for, and they applied for them as closed, similar to the brands. And that became quite a big policy discussion between ICANN Community, ICANN Board, and the GAC during the rollout of round one of the new gTLD process. So what ultimately happened is closed generics were not allowed, but now the question is, should they be prohibited, or should there be some certain circumstances where closed generics are permitted? Again, I think that's something else that we need some more public comment on, and I think that's the way this group is leaning. And then also string contention auctions of last resort. So these auctions of last resort, so in the applicant guidebook, if there were multiple people who applied for, multiple entities that applied for the same string in round one, I can really encourage them to try to work it out among themselves first. And if they, for whatever reason, they couldn't, then there could be what was called this auction of last resort that ICANN would run. And there's been some discussions about how maybe that isn't the best way to handle this. The whole auction process, the whole string contention process has been one that's been kind of rife with, you know, claims of people gaming the system, things like that, players just putting in applications hoping to get a big payout to be paid off to leave the kind of the fight to some others who may have applied for that string. So again, that's another area that still needs some work, still likely needs some further public comment, and is something that I think will need to be worked on further before this group can finish its work. So with all that being said, I think what we should really look for is for this work group to publish what they're kind of calling a pre-final report that will propose some solutions to the outstanding issues by the end of Q1 of 2020, with hopefully publication of their final report by the end of Q2. So we'll be watching for those reports, making sure that we look at them and see what kind of insight and commentary we can provide based on our experience with the new gTLDs and based on feedback we've received from clients through these years of the new gTLD program. So much more to come here, but again, they are kind of nearing the end of their work, but still some really important milestones to hit. So with those PDPs behind us, let's now look at DNS abuse. So DNS abuse is, again, becoming a hot topic in the ICANN community. It really kind of boils down to the definition of abuse. There's a lot of different kind of ICANN policies where the word abuse is used, and it's either not defined at all or very loosely defined. And, you know, for years and years and years, quite honestly, for as long as I have been involved with ICANN, which is coming up on 20 years, you know, ICANN's always kind of drawn the line in the sand that they are a kind of a technical administrator. They are responsible for kind of technical abuse and don't really believe that ICANN or its contracted parties should become arbiters of other forms of abuse, really related to content. And so there's definitely a tension and a debate going on about that sort of technical abuse position versus this broader definition of a DNS abuse that is starting to swirl again. It kind of comes up, I've seen it come up 2 or 3 times before in this kind of in ICANN community. Would say never to a great resolution, just sort of, I think, a bunch of people kind of coming to general agreement that it would be hard for ICANN and other contracted parties to get involved with kind of arbitrating other abuse, because some of that would require a lot of likely legal skill to be able to do, which are not necessarily competencies that any of those groups have, and how to scale that has also been a discussion. Nonetheless, before ICANN 66, some registrars and registries published a white paper. It's called Framework to Address Abuse, and in there it identified 5 categories of abuse: malware, botnets, phishing, farming, and spam. And it really also included a recommendation on when the contracted parties, meaning registries and registrars, would act on website content abuse. Things like child sexual abuse, illegal distribution of like opioids, human trafficking, and incitements of violence. But it did not go as far to include violations of IP rights. And that's something the business constituency and the IP constituency within ICANN feels really strongly should be included as part of what's meant by DNS abuse, and should be within the responsibilities of ICANN and the contracted parties. It is a pretty intense debate. The GAC is also very interested in this issue, and has really, I would say, tried to educate itself more and more about these different forms of abuse, so I think that's a good thing. There were also several panel discussions that occurred at ICANN on this topic, and I expect this really for the next year and a half likely to be a hot topic, and one where there'll be a number of discussions, white papers, and the like. And I think ultimately what will happen is we're going to get to contractual language in registry and registrar contracts in the future. Many of you may remember in 2013 there was an update to the registrar accreditation agreement that occurred, and all the registrars kind of had to sign on to that accreditation agreement, which had new obligations and things like that related to like resellers and privacy and proxy and things like that. So I expect that the next contract that registrars and registries will likely need to sign will start to include language around DNS abuse. I think it's going to take some time to come to some common definitions that everybody can be happy with. This is another one of those consensus issues that's going to take some time. So we'll continue to report out on it and share our insights in terms of where this issue is going and how we can influence it. All right, now we're going to wrap up by going through some of the issues that were raised and advice given through the GAC communique. So for those of you who are not familiar with what the GAC communique is that at the close of every ICANN meeting, the GAC will issue this kind of readout, if you will, of the ICANN meeting, where they kind of summarize their activities during the meeting, and then they'll provide any what they call advice to the ICANN board that they think is appropriate. And this advice is not just casual advice. It's something that is tracked very closely. There's, like kind of a spreadsheet that ICANN will keep that, lists all the different forms of advice that the GAC has provided. And there's, requirements for responding to the advice. And they need to kind of get to a point where they either accept the advice, accept the advice, basically agree with the advice, ask for clarification of the advice, or disagree with the advice. We actually saw for the first time sort of situations where the ICANN board did disagree with the advice. And when that happens, there's a whole process that kind of follows on to that. So GAC advice is not something just casually given and not kind of casually read over. it's something that really needs to be acted upon in some form or fashion by the ICANN board. And so they issue this communique at the end of the meeting. It's public on their website, and it's something that really represents the views of it will basically say the views of the entire GAC. So there are some instances where it may be kind of a minority view, and they'll note that when appropriate, but for the most part, the views are pretty, kind of consensus-based. So one of the items that was kind of forms pieces of advice that was given by the GAC in their communique this time around was around the timing of round 2. There's been kind of a lot of pushing from different corners of the community around when will round 2 be. Everybody wants a date. There is some clamor for the next round to open. At CSC, I can tell you we've gotten a fair number of phone calls and emails from people asking, when will the next round be, from companies that are interested in pursuing that brand. But for the most part, there hasn't been kind of a date put out there. And so the GAC's advice this time said that no additional new gTLD round should begin until ICANN implements certain prerequisite recommendations that were made by the Competition, Consumer Choice, and Consumer Trust Review Team. So this is a team that, for those of you who have attended our webinar series for a couple of years, you'll know that kind of right after, I would say probably like into 2015, into 2016, there was this effort launched of this CCT review. And it was sort of a broad umbrella review of the ICANN program. And there were some specific recommendations that came out from that. And it was really something where, some of it has kind of gotten incorporated or kind of subsumed by these different PDPs. There's some of the things that were in there were ultimately being taken up by these like the subpro or the RPM PDPs and other things. But there are some other recommendations in there, especially around anti-abuse measures, that the GAC is very interested in ICANN following through on. And so there's been discussion, debate, conversation about, well, maybe we could launch the next round in kind of parallel to some of these things being tied up. And it's clear the GAC is not interested in that. They want the policy work done, the corrective actions to be taken, and then the next round. And so what this says to me is we are more than a couple of years out from the next round in gTLDs. I know that's probably something that some folks might not want to hear, but I think there's a substantial amount of work that is going to need to be kind of put into the applicant guidebook and some of this abuse issue particularly, before we get to a point that the GAC is going to be comfortable with moving forward. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this slide, every time the GAC gives advice, the ICANN board either has to agree, ask for clarification, or disagree. And that disagree comes with a big process on the back of that. So the ICANN board tries to find ways not to disagree, but they have in the past, like I said, but we're more than a couple of years out from the next round in gTLD. The next issue is privacy proxy provider accreditation implementation. This is an issue that comes with a lot of what I will call baggage or history. Actually, back in 2013, when ICANN rolled out that new registrar accreditation agreement, there was language in there about further kind of regulation or oversight regarding privacy and proxy registration. And it had initially contemplated new rules before 2017. Unfortunately, that did not happen. And while the policy was approved by the ICANN board in August of 2016, the implementation was not ready by 2017. So ICANN kind of signed an amendment with all the registrars to kind of extend that time frame, and really an implementation review team was created to work through the policy implementation. Really the goal of this privacy and proxy provider accreditation policy was to increase oversight and control over privacy and proxy providers. It's been one of those things, there's kind of two areas in the domain ecosystem in terms of sort of people who do work for registrants that have always been a bit murky. One was resellers of registrars, and the second is privacy and proxy providers. These two areas have always kind of been these murky areas because ICANN is not directly, often not directly contracted with the providers of those kind of reseller or privacy proxy service. So it's kind of incumbent on the registrar to provide that oversight. But again, there's nothing specific that ICANN has delineated in terms of policy and kind of any kind of contractual compliance requirements. So that's, this was something where there was definitely a need for further policy. It's approved in August 2016. The IRT was put together, and it's had a lot of issues, a lot of contention in that group as it rolled on from 2016. But then came along all these WHOIS issues related to GDPR, and that sort of like was a massive collision of kind of, I would say, related issues. And so after time, between the contention within the group and the slow pace at which the work was going and sort of all the uncertainty brought upon by the GDPR, ICANN suspended the implementation team. And this was extremely disappointing to a lot of brand holders because this has been a black hole for a long time. And the policy was finally created, and it was now time for it to just get implemented. And again, ICANN just felt like it just wasn't the right time, and it was going to be inefficient because we'd have to backtrack. And there's been a lot of kind of pushback within the community itself, from registrars like CSC, from the intellectual property constituency, from the business constituency. We've all been pretty much saying, let's just get on with it. But what's been really helpful, I think, is now the GAC has come out as part of its advice in this communique and stated that ICANN should restart the privacy and proxy provider implementation team and basically work that issue parallel to the EPDP. ICANN had said, oh, let's wait till the EPDP is done and then we'll take it up after that. And the GAC has clearly said, no, these two issues need to be worked concurrently, not one after another. So I think that's great. Again, GAC Advice has tremendous weight in the ICANN community, with the board particularly. So this is, I think, a really good step and can really help shake this loose finally again to get work going. Then we move on again to .Amazon. I remember the last webinar I did, I created a slide that says the saga continues. And so when I was putting together my slides for this ICANN meeting, I just had to continue with that title because it was truly the case. So for those of you who may not have been following this issue very closely, one of the TLDs applied for during the new gTLD program was .Amazon. It was applied for by Amazon, the company, the online retailer. This has been a huge kind of point of contention between Amazon, the company, and the countries in the Amazon region. There was a lot of language in the new gTLD applicant guidebook around if you were going to use geographic indicators in any way, that you needed to go and get kind of approval from the government that kind of had rights to that geographic indication. The challenge with .Amazon has been it's sort of a region and not a specific area. And so that's there wasn't a lot of specificity, quite honestly, to like regional kind of things, regional terms. I think most people felt like you should have probably just followed the same rules as geographic indications and maybe gotten approval from all the governments in that region. But again, it's just sort of a lot of murkiness and sort of vagueness in that area. And so this has been a string that has been just cycled through a million different processes within the ICANN world as part of the new gTLD round 1. So after 7 years of debate between Amazon and the different Latin American countries, ICANN actually gave Amazon's new gTLD application from round 1 the go-ahead in May 2019. And people were pretty shocked about that. I mean, there'd been a lot of debate. Didn't seem to be full conclusion, but ICANN kind of stepped out there and said, we're moving ahead, approved, go. So the government of Colombia filed a motion for reconsideration, which is part of the ICANN bylaws, some of the process, and the application was again suspended. So there's been a lot of discussion, particularly within the GAC, and in the GAC's ICANN 66 communique, it's advised the ICANN board to facilitate negotiation between the Amazon region member states and Amazon Corporation to reach a mutually acceptable solution to allow for the use of .amazon. I think what everybody's trying to get at is this may not be a TLD that can be exclusively used by Amazon, the corporation, that maybe there's some way they can agree to some shared use. I think that will get complicated, the rules will get complicated, the costs, support, things like that will get complicated. But I think that's what the GAC is trying to, and they kind of see the stalemate that's going on back and forth here, and I think they're trying to encourage the parties to find a way to work together. So we're going to watch this again. It's more one of those issues that I think the specific company, Amazon is not what I think is interesting here. I think this is going to help be a precursor to how some of these geographic regional TLD potential strings will be handled in the next round. I think they're working through some policy work on that, but I think this case is a very strong use case of how things can go wrong and potentially how things can be resolved. So we'll watch this one closely. And then finally, let's talk about the GAC advice related to the EPDP process. So the GAC has been following the EPDP very carefully. They've been sending representatives to even participate in some of the groups to listen to kind of make sure that they're staying pace with what is being discussed. And in this communique, the GAC advised the ICANN board to basically ensure that reasonable access to non-public domain name registration data. So that's that contact data that we were talking about that, is kind of that non-public data. It's beyond what the domain, like registration date, the DNS, who the registrar is, contact data. They want to make sure that that process is operated effectively, and they want to make sure that the implementation really includes some key components. One is educating key stakeholder groups that there is a process for requesting non-public data. And, when I read that one particularly, this is them kind of saying, look, the first, when we rolled out the new gTLD program, there was a lot of concern that the world at large wasn't aware of the program, much less how to participate. And especially in areas of the world that may not be as sort of internet savvy. Maybe the internet is just sort of an emerging thing in that region or in that country. And so, the GAC wants to make sure that there's a fair amount of education being done to key stakeholder groups to make sure that they're aware there is a process. Secondly, they want to actively make available a standard request form that can be used by stakeholders to request access based on the current consensus policy. So they don't want it sort of like, here's a policy and then everybody kind of implements it their own way. They, it's kind of what the request format needs to look like. on a standard form. Everybody uses it, so that, again, it sort of makes sure that everybody's on the same page and everybody has the same information and understands what the process is. And then also, they want to make sure that links to registrar and registry information and points of contact are readily available. So again, it's education and access. They really want to make sure that everyone knows, they know what the process is, they know what the forms are, they know how to get the information, how to get the forms, how to contact registries and registrars. It's about that transparency that the GAC is really focused on here with relation to the EPDP. And I think there are important points that, while other groups, I think, have talked about them, I think the GAC has done a really good thing here by kind of blatantly stating this is an expectation they have. Again, the advice that they provide the ICANN board is something that carries a lot of weight, and ICANN board either needs to agree and implement, find, ask for clarification, or disagree with. So I think these are good points to be made by the GAC at this